They say life is about the journey and not the destination. And that's absolutely true when you're camping to ride. When you're riding to camp, however, life is absolutely about the destination. There are a million different ways to go camping on a motorcycle. Moto camping can mean hauling a trailer hundreds of miles behind a gold wing, camping under a tarp off of your dual sport deep in the backcountry, or just throwing a tent on your scooter and riding to the local state park for the night. No matter what kind of trip you're planning, it probably falls into one of two categories, however, and knowing which it is can be the key to planning a successful and enjoyable motorcycle camping excursion. The question to ask is this: are you riding to camp or camping to ride? So what's the difference between riding to camp and camping to ride? If the camping or the destination itself is the biggest part of the trip, if it's the point of the trip, you're probably riding to camp. These trips typically involve spending a decent amount of time at your destination, whether that's hanging out at the campground itself and chilling around the campfire, or setting up camp somewhere and exploring the surrounding area, either on foot or on the bike or on a bus or something, I don't know. Ride to camp trips generally have easier riding or long highway stretches. You can bring more gear and be as comfortable as possible because weight and size isn't as important on this type of trip. And often, but not always, you're talking about more highway or easier off-road. The actual riding is not as difficult generally on a riding to camp trip. It's just how you're getting to where you're going. Food on these trips can be more elaborate. You have more room for coolers and other stuff to bring more ingredients. Or if you're camping near a store, you can pick up stuff and bring it back to camp. You have more room for dishes and other cooking utensils to make a nicer, more elaborate meal. Most of my overnight trip videos on the Dork on the Road channel fall into this category, where I'd pack up a bunch of gear, ride out to a place, and just hang out at camp, enjoy a few beers, campfire, all that. Low-key, easy, comfortable. That's a ride to camp trip. The flip side to that is a camp to ride trip. And this is a trip where the riding itself is the point of the journey. Either you're traveling or trying to cover distance, or you're trying to ride through very interesting, awesome places, a little bit harder, a little bit faster. It's a little bit different type of trip. A great example of a camp to ride trip is a BDR trip. You're trying to cover miles in the backcountry, you're camping, but you're getting to camp, cooking, going to sleep, getting up, riding again in the morning, long days on the bike, shorter days in camp. That is sort of one of the hallmarks of a camp to ride trip. On a trip like this, you want to think more minimally. Lighter gear and less of it makes riding the tough stuff easier. You generally bring fewer luxuries and your food is acquired along the way, or simple stuff like dehydrated meals. Now, this can be on or off-road trips. Either way, it's still a camp to ride trip. If you're trying to cover as many miles as possible in a short time and you're just sleeping in camp, getting up and riding more, whether that's on or off-road, that is a camp to ride trip. So how do you know the difference? Well, all the things I just told you, but it's not always a hard and fast rule. Like many things, there are gray areas, and it's really a sliding scale with camp to ride on one side and ride to camp on the other. You can have fun riding to a ride to camp destination. The riding can be part of the fun. Obviously, you just take your car, and you can be more comfortable on a camp to ride trip, but most of the time, your trip is going to be more one than the other. So if you're spending more time on the bike than at camp, that's probably a camp to ride trip. If you're spending more time at camp than on the bike, or off the bike than on the bike, that's probably a ride to camp trip. Another way to think about it is how long or how much of the time is the gear on your bike. If there's more time where the gear is on your bike than not on your bike, that's probably a camp to ride trip. If you take the gear off and do a bunch of riding without it, that's probably a ride to camp trip. Okay, Mr. Expert Man, what about base camping? First of all, what is base camping? Well, that's when you ride your bike to a place with all your gear on it, unload it, set up camp, and then spend your days riding out from camp and back, exploring or just seeing the sights nearby. A great example of that is an ADV rally, like the Giant Loop ride, or the Touratech rally, or the Dork in the Road campout. We ride there, park, set up our stuff, and then go out and ride with nothing on the bikes but ourselves, a few tools, and some water. So the riding is harder and more fun, but you're not burdened by all of your gear. That is still, in my opinion, a ride to camp trip, because you can still bring all your luxuries, because the majority of the riding to get there is easier, and so you're not going to be burdened by them as much. Great, cool, awesome. I just listened to you for 5 minutes blathering on about ride to camp versus camp to ride. What does it matter? Well, knowing what kind of trip you're going on can help you plan what kind of gear you want to take on that trip. Having some idea which category your trip falls into can help you plan logistics and food and think about how and where and when you want to camp. Ride to camp trips allow you to bring along more luxuries and be quite a bit more comfortable depending on how you plan and what you bring. Luxuries like bigger sleeping bags and pads, chairs, folding tables, a bigger cook setup with multiple pots and pans so you can cook more elaborate, nicer meals. You have room for soft coolers, extra clothes, slippers, etc., multiple pillows. Some people even bring cots on this kind of trip. You can bring along tarps and things like that for more elaborate camp setups, particularly if you're camping in bad weather. It's nice to have those extra pieces. You can bring along multiple ways to process firewood. Buck up the wood with your saw, chop it down into kindling with your axe, or just buy firewood because you have, again, more room for more luxuries depending on where you're going. It's also easier to have luxuries like cold beer, like if you go to camp, unload, and then throw a bag of ice into your bag with some beer. It's one of the things I love to do when I'm riding to camp often. You see me do that in videos. Camp to ride trips, however, generally require more minimal setup. You're generally going to have less gear, lighter gear, because you're going to be riding harder or more or both. Stuff like bringing a quilt instead of a sleeping bag. They pack smaller, they're lighter, less bulky. Smaller packing, less comfortable pads and pillows. A simpler cooking setup, whether that's just a jet boil or a pocket rocket and a simple metal pot. More multi-purpose tools, you're going to want to reduce redundancies. So on a ride to camp trip, you may have multiple lights because you like to light up the whole campsite. On a camp to ride trip, you may just have your headlamp, or you're going to want a light that's a combination. Like I have that pump that's also a tent light. That's nice because it does two things, but you're not going to bring multiple lights and take up a bunch of extra space and have to worry about charging and storing batteries for those things. You're probably not going to bring a hatchet and a saw. You're going to have to get by with one or the other. Or maybe you don't bring any wood processing tools at all. You're going to do things like baton down your kindling with your knife that you're already carrying because it's multiple purpose. No luxuries, like maybe a minimal flask of whiskey. It's hard to bring beer and keep it cold on these long trips where you're getting into camp late, setting up camp, going to sleep, getting up, and getting out and riding the next morning. The point is not to hang out at camp. The point is to sleep there and continue your journey. You're going to have fewer changes of clothes, probably. You may have to do some camp laundry depending how long the trip is, and you're probably not going to have room for extra pairs of shoes and stuff like that, so you're going to be spending a lot of time in your riding gear around camp, wearing your boots, all of that stuff on a camp to ride trip. So thinking about your next camping trip that you're planning, or maybe a trip that you're planning for this year, which is it? Riding to camp or camping to ride? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget that motocampnerd.com has the world's best, carefully curated selection of motorcycle camping gear designed to fit all of your needs, whether you're riding to camp or camping to ride. So make sure you pop over to the site no matter what kind of trip you're planning, and or if you want stuff that does both, there's a great selection of it at motocampnerd.com. No matter your needs, Moto Camp Nerd has the gear you need so you can pack small and camp easy.